Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show.
Joso's underlings were continuously mocking Mason and jeering at him. However, at this moment, a figure suddenly inserted itself between them and Mason, staring at them silently with an icy cold gaze. "Oren, I was about to go look for you. I didn't expect you to come here yourself." Despite saying that, Joso was still a little fearful. Although Joso was a level 19 archmage, making him 2 levels more advanced than Oren and enjoying a greater advantage in a real fight, the madness that Oren had when he fought had left a deep impression on him. During a few battles in the past, Joso had to pay a huge price even though he managed to obtain victory in the end. Hence, Joso looked at the two of them and pretended to be magnanimous. "Mason, Oren, this is the Supreme Council. I'm giving you two a chance to apologize to me for what happened yesterday. I'll let you off if you do." However, there was no change on Oren's face after he heard Joso's words. Instead, he began to induce mana into his staff, seemingly ready to attack so long as the other party didn't let go. Seeing how dauntless Oren was, Joso finally lost his temper and gestured for his underlings to take action, after which the few of them immediately surrounded Mason and Oren. He was in the midst of feeling prideful. Hence, he obviously wouldn't want to get himself into a pathetic state, and planned to surround and beat them up. Those who could move around in the Sky Garden were all archmages. Joso was a level 19 archmage, and his underlings were level 16 and level 17 archmages. Hence, it was definitely easy for them to deal with Mason and Oren. Even if Oren and Mason had combat power that was beyond level 17, they would definitely still be unable to break out of a siege of so many people. However, at this moment, Joso felt an incredibly familiar sensation that appeared in his body again. He once again lost control of his body. Besides, the underlings beside Joso were all terrorized as fear was written all over their faces. Their movements stiffened as well, and they were clearly subjected to the same treatment as their boss, Joso. "Flick, you bastard, I won't let you off." Joso had already had prior experience, and he immediately reacted. He knew that it was definitely Linley, and so he immediately started hollering at him. "Mason, Oren, leave with me. Let's not waste any more time. I've made arrangements for you guys to study the core magical mantras of the core library." Not looking at Joso and the rest, Linley treated them like they didn't exist at all. The core library was the place where the precious reading materials of the Supreme Council, as well as the research results of the mages over the past 1,300 years were stored. They were usually only open to mages who were directly under the Supreme Council. Although the library would be open to the students of the counselors during the meeting, they had no right to enter the Eternal Library. After all, even in the entire Supreme Council, the magical books they collected would not be free for reading for all the members. Mason and Oren, who had agreed to meet Linley at the Supreme Council's library, never thought that Linley would help them get a chance to enter the core library. The situation was already extremely bad for them, yet they suddenly received such good news. On top of having their crisis resolved, they couldn't even recover from the shock, and were simply stunned. The first to react was instead Joso, who was about to go crazy because of the news. He had followed his teacher to the Supreme Council more than a few times, and he often tried to use that excuse to enter the library. However, he could never enter the core library even though his teacher had sought out many connections. "Damn it, Flick, you won't be smug for long. Let go of me and apologize to me. Now, maybe you can still save yourself." Joso seemed to have calmed down a bit as he was no longer yelling at the top of his lungs. However, his voice was still cold and vicious. However, Linley, who had entered from the back, ignored Joso completely as if Joso was just a noisy fly. At this moment, Mason and Oren also finally came back to their senses, and walked away from Joso and the rest. They quickly scurried to Linley. At the thought of Joso's words, Mason felt a little worried, and he said to Linley, "Flick, they seem to have devised some kind of plot against you and the Tower of Dusk. They're just clowns who are trying to stir trouble. Don't bother. Let's go. The meeting is probably going to end in a few days. Go to the core library and study at ease for a few days. How much you can benefit from it is still up to you." Linley chuckled nonchalantly and thought, can the schemes and tricks of insignificant ants affect sanctuary powerhouses? Obviously not. Clowns who are trying to stir trouble. How dare you call me a clown? Flick, you don't have to be smug. You're going to be finished. You know, you and your Tower of Dusk are going to be destroyed. Everything you have now is going to be lost to me. You're going to end up in a pathetic state soon. Seeing that Linley had ignored him, and was about to leave with Mason and Oren, Joso and his subordinates began yelling and cursing their hearts out like madmen. After all, being confined in such a place was not something to be proud of. However, not long after they did, they fell silent again without warning. It was unlike being strangled as an invisible force deprived them of their ability to speak, instantly making them feel like they couldn't make a single sound. From what Mason and Oren knew about Joso and the rest, they knew that it was impossible for them to consciously shut up, and there was no doubt that the reason was Linley. However, what surprised the two of them was that they did not feel any magical waves from Linley, even though they were right beside him when he cast the spell. Both of them knew that there were various types of control magic among the various types of magic spells, such as magical paralysis, ice element magic spells, that slowed one's reaction down, and so on. However, their effects did not last long, and would perhaps only last for a few seconds. Now, Joso and his underlings were all archmages, and not only were they being physically imprisoned and sealed at the same time, but it didn't look like they would be released soon. Was that something a legendary mage could do? In Mason's and Oren's opinion, Lin Li's abilities were far beyond the early stages of the legendary realm. Of course, in reality even a legendary powerhouse might not be able to do what Linley did. Restraining a few archmages with a single thought was already close to a divine technique and an extreme use of nomological power. It was far beyond the existing magic system, something that Mason and Oren simply could not understand. Linley left with Mason and Oren immediately, while Joso and the others seemed to have become a unique sight on the pathway, attracting countless onlookers. Having their movements restricted and their ability to speak sealed, Joso and the rest allowed others to point them out and gossip about them. To Joso, it was a huge shame, and the boundless resentment was almost driving him insane. Besides, the legendary mages in the Sky Garden, including Joso's teacher, were all preparing for today's meeting at the moment. That meant that Joso and the rest would have to be on display for an entire day. Joso and the rest had no idea that even the legendary mages could not save them. Damn it, I swear, I'll make sure you die without a burial. At this moment, all Joso could do was to continuously curse in his heart and imagine how he could deal with Linley in the future. On the way to the core library, Mason still couldn't help but remind Linley, "Flick, is it okay to leave them there? I heard Joso clamoring just now, and he seems to have a backer. He doesn't seem to be lying. I think you should be more careful." "Okay, you have to be careful." Given Oren's character, he obviously cared about Linley since he said those words. "We're here." Linley stopped outside the core library, smiled, and said to the two of them, "You don't need to think about this matter. Feel at ease to study here. There is nothing that can threaten me now yet." Linley wasn't bragging. Given his sanctuary realm power, and the 7 powerful pieces of the debris of the stars, no one would be able to stop him from leaving, not even the 3 arbitrators who were sanctuary powerhouses. Of course, he didn't think that a small fry like Joso could come up with a scheme that would involve the arbitrators. Small fries were just small fries. No matter what schemes they had, it would be nothing more than a joke in the eyes of the sanctuary powerhouses. Hence, why would Linley waste his energy on it? He didn't care at all. After sending Mason and Oren to the core library, Linley returned to the Eternal Tower and prepared to attend the meeting. However, what was different from yesterday was that this time, he clearly felt that there were many more gazes landing on him, each having a different meaning. If he were still in the legendary realm like before, Linley would have had to do some calculations. However, he was now a sanctuary powerhouse, and naturally didn't bother to pay attention to the insignificant figures. He returned to his seat. "Flick, I really have to thank you. If it weren't for this incident, how would I have been able to get connected to Deputy Chairman Rosen?" Councillor Lettings, who had once been scared to death outside of Linley's room, looked at Linley, who was sitting quietly in the corner in the distance, with a smug smile on his lips. In the entire venue, there were quite a few councillors who thought the same as Lettings. It was simply impossible to say that no one was jealous of the Tower of Dusk's massive wealth. This time, although the target was the Terra Mine, and did not involve the other industries of the Tower of Dusk, wouldn't it be even easier to divide the wealth of the Tower of Dusk if the proposal was passed? As for Rosen, who was already seated at the deputy chairman's desk, he looked up to look around the entire venue, and seemed to be confident about winning. In fact, even Rosen himself didn't expect the plan to be executed so smoothly this time. After confirming the number of votes he had secured, he already had more than half of the votes of the entire council. Even if the neutral councillors all stood on Andoin's side, there was no chance for Andoin to turn the tables. Rosen could well imagine that once the proposal passed, it would not only bring great benefits to himself, but would also fundamentally shake Andoin's position in the council. As the chairman, Andoin couldn't even protect the interests of his own disciple. In that case, what kind of authority would he have in the future? Rosen believed that it wouldn't be long before the councillors who originally stood on Andoin's side would quickly lose confidence in him. By that time, as long as he united the councillors again and went against Andoin, he would be able to become the chairman. That was the true gain, that was even greater than the ownership of the Terra mine. The entire Supreme Council would truly be under his control. Looking at Anduin, who was sitting not far away from him, he couldn't help but sneer in his heart. Old rival, don't blame me for not giving you face, blame it only on the fact that you took in a student who is a troublemaker. Indeed, if it weren't for the fact that Linley had offended Joso and Lettings as soon as he arrived at the Sky Garden, Rosen might still be worrying that he didn't have enough votes. Although the number of votes that Lettings had gotten for him was not high, they consisted of the crucial few votes that gave Rosen control over the situation. Soon, the councillors had all taken their seats, and as Anduin gently tapped the brass bell on the table, the entire meeting venue immediately fell silent. During yesterday's meeting, there had yet to be a conclusion for the topic of the war between the Leaden Kingdom and the Felon Kingdom. Hence, the first discussion that day was still about that issue. After 10 minutes of discussion, it went into the voting process again, and in the end, more than half of the council members were not in favor of waging a war. When the attendees of the meeting were ready to start discussing the next motion, Rosen finally made his move, taking out the proposal that he had prepared overnight. If Rosen was an ordinary councillor, the discussion for the proposal would be postponed to the next regular meeting, but Rosen was the deputy chairman of the Supreme Council. He had the power to request for the discussion of the proposal to be brought forward. That was something that even Anduin could not stop. Besides, Rosen also emphasized that the proposal would have a crucial impact on the development of the Supreme Council. The Supreme Council has been established for more than 1,300 years, but in the last several hundred years, the development of the Supreme Council has reached a bottleneck and stagnated. I believe you are all aware of this fact. One of the greatest reasons is that the Terra Mithril, that plays a crucial role in magic research, is no longer able to meet the needs of the Supreme Council. That is also why the development of magic for us humans has plateaued. Rosen's opening speech had undoubtedly made numerous councillors nod. Anduin immediately understood Rosen's intentions after hearing Rosen mention the Terra Mithril now. However, he thought that it would be impossible for him to stop them. The proposal was very sudden, and it caught Anduin off guard. Anduin couldn't inform the councillors on his side in advance. Besides, when Anduin scanned the venue and saw the expressions on the faces of the many councillors, his heart sank even lower. Only a small number of councillors looked surprised, and most of them were elated. Clearly, Rosen had done sufficient preparatory work. Looking at a gaze that was directed towards him, Lin Li did not seem angry at all, even though the other party's shamelessness was beyond his imagination. However, there was nothing he could do even if the proposal was accepted. It was not that easy to take advantage of the Tower of Dusk. With a smug expression on his face, Rosen cleared his throat and continued, "The good thing is, the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic has recently discovered a rich reserve of Terra ore in the Breezy Plains. However, some selfish people have restricted the supply of Terra ore, as they have no concern for the greater good. Such behavior has severely restricted the Supreme Council's magical research, and is a crime against the magical development of humans. Hence, I suggest that the Supreme Council takes over the rights to the Terra mine of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic." Rosen finally revealed his true intentions, and the peace in the conference hall was instantly broken by the discussion between the councillors. However, they could all tell that there were more voices of approval from the councillors than there were voices of apprehension. Even the councillors who were initially in neutral positions gradually began to waver and get tempted by the idealistic prospects suggested by the crowd. I think that Deputy Chairman Rosen's proposal is indeed of great benefit to the development of the Supreme Council. The Supreme Council is undoubtedly the pioneer of magic civilization among humans. Hence, magic civilization can only be better promoted if the entire Terra mine is managed by the Supreme Council. Only then can its uses be maximized. Shortly after Rosen spoke, Hubert, Rosen's loyal follower, stood up to voice his opinion. Over the past 1,300 years, there had been no guild of magic in the Breezy Plains before the Tower of Dusk, and there was a reason for that. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic was struggling to survive when it was first established. Almost no one was optimistic about its future, and some even doubted if and speculated how long it could exist for. Under Lin Li's management, the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic, or rather the Tower of Dusk, managed to develop to the extent that was beyond imaginable. It was impossible for there to be no jealous outsiders. However, due to the Tower of Dusk's location, which was further away from the so-called magic center, other guilds of magic barely had the opportunity to deal with the Tower of Dusk. Hence, they could only keep their jealousy to themselves. Rosen's proposal had undoubtedly given an opportunity for them. That was human psychology. One could never be pleased to see someone else doing well while they were stuck in a rut. Hence, some councillors who were originally in a neutral position soon stood on Rosen's side, and even began thinking about the matters regarding the future distribution and wonderful development. I think that this proposal of Deputy Chairman Rosen seems a bit inappropriate. The Terra Mine was discovered and developed by President Flick of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic, and the ownership should rightfully belong to them. Besides, President Flick had been selflessly supplying a large amount of Terra Mithril to the Supreme Council, which is already a great contribution. Not only did he not get rewarded, now you actually want to deny his rights to the mine. Isn't that too harsh and cruel? Aldwin voiced his doubts after seeing that the discussion was getting heated. Ever since they had explored Osric's mausoleum, Aldwin had begun disliking Rosen. If it weren't for the fact that Rosen had pulled those tricks presumptuously, the Alana Guild of Magic wouldn't have incurred such a huge loss. Although the Supreme Council had also given them some compensation afterwards, talents could not be cultivated overnight, and the mages had still yet to recover completely even until now. Hence, Aldwin genuinely detested Rosen's behavior of seeking personal benefits for himself, under the facade of acting in the best interests of the Supreme Council. Besides, Rosen was going against Andoin's student, Linley. No matter what, Aldwin would never stay quiet and do nothing about it. President Aldwin, that's not right. As a member of the Supreme Council, one should consider the interests of the Supreme Council before anything else, and not be preoccupied with personal gains and losses. The one who spoke was Lettings, who had just reached an agreement with Rosen. Since he had decided to stand on Rosen's side, he had to show enough sincerity. Hence, he stood up with a solemn and austere expression, and said, "Everyone knows that the forces of various sizes in the Breezy Plains are complicated, and word about the discovery of the Terra Mine will definitely spread soon. Once the established local forces find out, I'm afraid it won't be easy to keep the Terra Mine given the power of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic. Hence, for this consideration, I also think that the Terra Mine should be taken over by the Supreme Council." Letting's words caused the councillors to nod repeatedly. Although the Breezy Plains still belonged to the Felon Kingdom in theory, it was still a bit too far away from the many traditional guilds of magic, after all. Hence, the news was naturally not delivered in time. However, even if they'd got the news in time, they probably wouldn't have believed that a guild of magic that had only been established for a few years could subdue the numerous powerful forces in the Breezy Plains. The Terra Mine was enough to make any force go crazy, and whether or not the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic could keep the Terra Mine was indeed a considerable issue that could not be ignored in the eyes of many people. If it were guarded and managed by the Supreme Council, no one in the entire Enroll would dare to covet it, let alone the Breezy Plains forces. Yes, there's a reason the Breezy Plains is known to be chaotic. If word about the Terra Mine spreads, it might cause the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic to be extinguished. We'd better leave it to the Supreme Council. Indeed, originally I thought that Deputy Chairman might have some selfish motives, but it seems that I didn't consider it thoroughly enough. This matter should actually be considered a good thing for the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic. What do you guys think? If we have to vote, I think I'll vote for it. Even if it was out of consideration of fairness, a few of the neutral councillors could not help but gravitate towards Rosen's proposal. Besides, they felt that the Terra Mine could also cause the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic to get rid of fatal trouble. Hence, giving the rights to the mine to the Supreme Council was not only not encroaching on the interests of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic, it also helped them resolve the crisis. What kind of logic is this? You want to take away his assets just because you think he can't protect it. You are afraid that the Terra Mine would cause other forces in the Breezy Plains to fight over it, so the Supreme Council should take over its management. What an absurd reason. According to this logic, all of you sitting here who are presidents of guilds of magic should surrender all your properties and resources to the Supreme Council and have it manage them. Macklin sneered in exasperation as he scanned the faces of the clamoring councillors. He could not hide the sarcasm in his voice. Councillor Macklin, please don't twist the logic. You should be well aware of the value of the Terra Mine. It is far from being a resource that can be compared in a general sense. The Supreme Council has the ability to turn the value of the Terra Mine into a driving force for the development of magic civilization. The results of magical research will also be imparted to the guilds of magic. Isn't that a good thing for everyone? Faced with Macklin's accusation, Lettings did not succumb at all. In the past, he would have never dared to behave that way, but now he had Deputy Chairman Rosen as his backer. Hence, he obviously was dauntless. Before Macklin retorted, another high-ranking councillor stood up. He had a full head of white hair and a wrinkled, sullen face with no expression. He said in a hoarse voice, "Councillor Macklin, Councillor Aldwin, please mind your words. You have been emphasizing the fact that we are encroaching. Has the Supreme Council become bandits? The Supreme Council is the leader of all guilds of magic, and any guild of magic is definitely established with the support of the Supreme Council. Without the Supreme Council, there would be no Guild of Magic. The establishment of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic was a chance that the Supreme Council fought for. The Guild of Magic should be proud to contribute to the Supreme Council. That high-ranking counselor was the president of the Garesco City Guild of Magic, the legendary mage Cayman. One could guess from the name of Garesco City that it was largely related to Garesco, the god of mages. It was said to be the birthplace of Garesco. It was said that when the Supreme Council chose the location for the establishment of the Guild of Magic headquarters, Garesco City was once Alana's strongest competitor. Moreover, at that time, there were many people who supported Garesco City, including the 3 arbitrators. After all, the Supreme Council was established by Garesco. However, Garesco, the god of mages, still ended up choosing Alana as the place for the Guild of Magic headquarters, perhaps due to some specific reason. However, as the birthplace of the god of mages, Garesco City Guild of Magic had a rather high status in the Supreme Council. The Alana Guild of Magic and the Garesco City Guild of Magic were even known as the North and South Magic capitals in the Felon Kingdom. One was the Guild of Magic appointed by Garesco, while the other was the Guild of Magic of the birthplace of Garesco. The 2 guilds of magic had a history of over 1,000 years since their establishment. Hence, they were not considered to be at odds, but there was clearly a fierce competition between them. It was precisely because of that when Aldwin of the Alana Guild of Magic stood on Chairman Andoin's side, Candyman of the Garesco City Guild of Magic was also influenced and solicited by Deputy Chairman Rosen. Although now, with the passing of the years, the god of mages Garesco had already become a myth, Candyman's prestige in the Supreme Council was not inferior to that of Aldwin. As Candyman spoke, everyone could tell that Rosen had the upper hand, and the proposal would pass without any slip-ups. After raising his hand to stop the discussion between the councillors, Rosen sat by the side with some pride in his eyes, and questioned Andoin, who was sitting not far away. Chairman Andoin, the discussion of this proposal has been going on for a while. Can we proceed to the voting process? Voting. They didn't need a vote to tell that 2/3 of the councillors were going to support Rosen's proposal. Although Andoin was calm on the surface, he had already begun cursing his heart out deep down. If he had enough time to prepare, it wouldn't be difficult to break the conspiracy, but the problem now was that there was no time to do so. However, just as Andoin was being stuck in a dilemma, a calm voice suddenly sounded from the corner of the venue that had already returned to silence. There's no need to vote. You want the Terra mine, right? No problem. I can give it to the Supreme Council. In an instant, all eyes were on the corner where the sound had come from. The person seated there was none other than Lin Li. Although everyone knew that it was almost inevitable for the Tower of Dusk to lose the Terra mine, they were still shocked when they heard Lin Li say those words calmly. How pretentious, Rosen thought to himself and sneered. He then said, "Very well, it is indeed commendable for Councillor Flick to be able to put the interests of everyone first. In this case, Chairman Andoin, please announce the approval of this proposal." In Rosen's opinion, Linley had to have felt that the matter was irrevocable, and thus took the initiative to come forward to say that to reduce the impact on Andoin's prestige and authority. Fulik. Andoin was puzzled about Linley's actions, but at the thought of the fact that he could not provide sufficient help for Linley, he could not help but feel guilty. Linley stood up from his seat and gave Andoin a comforting smile. However, his face grew sullen afterwards, and he stared at the councillors coldly yet nonchalantly. With composure and indifference, he said, "Giving the Terra mine to the Supreme Council will help promote the development of magical civilization. I have no problem with it. However, I also hope that you can all understand that the Terra mine plays an important role in the establishment of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic amidst the local chaos. Hence, for the sake of the development of the Guild of Magic, I would like to go back and send some people to the Caucaso region, the New Crescent Mountains, and the Manskor region to explore and look for new Terra mines. By then, I hope that the guilds of magic of these areas will be able to consider the greater good, lest we create any unnecessary misunderstandings." As soon as Linley said those words, all the councillors were flabbergasted, and they got into an uproar as if his words were like a bomb. If the areas that Linley was talking about were those natural restricted areas, others might really have suspected if he had secretly located some sources of the Terra mine. However, it was clear to every councillor present that the regions Linley was talking about were simply the regions where the guilds of magic helmed by the councillors, who expressed their strong approval for the proposal, were based. The Caucaso region was the territory of the Garesco City Guild of Magic, and a large amount of its magical resources came from that region. The New Crescent Mountains were the territory of the New Crescent City Guild of Magic. Their crescent magical gemstones were their specialty, and their most important resource. The Manskor region had always been jointly owned by the Geno Guild of Magic and the Trit Guild of Magic. The presidents of the two guilds of magic were also strong supporters of Rosen. Hence, It was obvious why Linley had chosen those regions. Canyon slapped the table and stood up, after which a legendary wave of mana was released. He glared at Linley and said in a sullen tone, "President Flick, are you threatening us?" The Garesco City Guild of Magic and the Alana Guild of Magic could be called the North and South Magic capitals of Felon Kingdom. As the president of the Guild of Magic, Canyon's abilities were not to be underestimated. At this time, he unleashed his huge magical waves, and even the counselors beside him could feel massive pressure. "Threaten? No, it's just a friendly reminder from me." In the face of the pressure caused by the massive magical waves, Linley remained calm and still. All right, we'll always be welcoming you. However, accidents are inevitable, and I hope you will be prepared to bleed." President Flick. Canyon burst into laughter out of pique, and his gloomy tone made everyone shudder. Everyone knew that the strength of the Garesco City Guild of Magic was not inferior to the Alana Guild of Magics. The president of a guild of magic that had only been established for a few years actually dared to issue such a threat. He was just courting death. Not only did he fail to threaten the other party, he even ended up being forced into a desperate situation by the other party's words. He would probably have to eat his words, or so Rosen's supporters thought, staring at Linley in a gloating manner. However, Linley didn't care about the gazes of the others, and instead hostilely said, "Rest assured, I'm certain that just you'll bleed." The presidents of the guilds of magic, including Lettings, all stood up in exasperation and disbelief. "What do you mean, challenging the guilds of magic altogether? Does he think he's the Supreme Council? Flick, are you declaring war on us?" Lettings hollered. He was so infuriated that he was trembling. He felt that Linley was simply too arrogant and lawless. "Will it be us that bleed? Today, we're standing before so many counselors. I will see what means you have to have the audacity to be so arrogant." Canyon then took out his staff and turned to look at Andoin and Rosen. He said, "Chairman and Deputy Chairman, I would like the conference to be paused for a while. Since his teacher didn't teach him how to behave, I don't mind teaching him a good lesson." He was even scolding Andoin. Of course, Canyon had no idea that Linley was also Andoin's student. He merely knew that Linley was from Jurosis in the countryside. Canyon was extremely confident about defeating Linley, even though he had already heard about Linley stepping into the legendary realm. However, in his opinion, he felt that a legendary mage, who had merely stepped into the legendary realm less than 2 years ago could not compare to him, a legendary powerhouse who had stepped into the legendary realm decades earlier. Only those who had stepped into the legendary realm would know how difficult it was to increase their strength and advance in the legendary realm. Every level seemed like an insurmountable barrier. Even for those with extremely high magical talent, it would often take numerous years, or over a decade of hard work to advance by one level. The only people who had truly broken that rule in Anril were probably just the god of mages Garesco, and the 3 arbitrators. Canyon had stepped into the legendary realm decades ago, and was now a level 23 legendary powerhouse, who was at the peak. His speed of advancement was already considered quite astonishing. In his opinion, even if Linley had the magical talent of Garesco, he would at most have reached level 21 in 2 to 3 years' time. He would definitely win the battle with his special talent. Canyon was not the only one. In fact, the counselors present mostly had the same thoughts as well. Lettings and the rest who had been named by Linley just now were thrilled. Being threatened by a young junior in front of everyone was infuriating. Even if Canyon had not intervened, they would have gotten ready to attack. At this moment, everyone shifted their gazes to Linley, waiting to see whether the arrogant young man would bite the bullet and accept the battle, or take his words back cowardly without a backbone. However, before Linley could even speak, a giant magic hand suddenly appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the venue. Not allowing them to react, the hand landed on Canyon, who was clamoring for a battle. In plain sight, it tossed Canyon, the level 23 legendary mage, out of the venue. That scene made everyone feel shocked and dumbfounded. Canyon was the president of the Garesco City Guild of Magic, and his status was not much inferior to that of Aldwin. More importantly, he was a level 23 legendary mage. Yet, he was like a pitiful worm that could not resist the hand of the mage. In the entire Sky Garden, there were only 3 people who possessed such power. They were none other than the 3 arbitrators of the Supreme Council. Everyone fell silent, and their breathing became slower too. They were focusing their eyes on the young mage in the corner. How could that be? Isn't his backer Chairman Andoin? Why would an arbitrator attack at this time? Is it really to protect him? An arbitrator is a sanctuary powerhouse, a godly existence. To the arbitrators, counselors and legendary mages are all insignificant ants. How could they attack because of an insignificant ant? Lettings merely felt cold chills down his spine. Indeed, the deputy chairman he relied on didn't have to be afraid of Andoin anymore, and today's plan was all going well. He was about to get his revenge soon, and yet an arbitrator suddenly intervened. This is too scary. What does the arbitrator mean? Is he going to protect that Felix? Lettings was not the only one. The people who had just strongly supported Rosen's proposal all wished they could duck under the table. If the arbitrator had been unhappy just with the argument during the meeting, he would have thrown both Calamity and Linley out because it was between the two of them. Since he had only punished one of them, it was enough to show the arbitrator's bias. Indeed, under the gaze of the crowd, Arbitrator Apophis appeared at the entrance, and although he was not that tall, he made the crowd feel an infinite amount of pressure. The slow footsteps were particularly clear in the silent hall, and it felt as if he was walking on their chests. After entering the venue, Apophis didn't make any comments on what had just happened. He did not make any comments, and he simply looked around. Those who he looked at could not help but lower their heads. No one dared to make eye contact with Apophis. No one dared to make a single sound. It wasn't until he saw Lin Li in the corner that his expression became less sullen. Felix, come with me. We have something to discuss with you. Perhaps in the eyes of others, Arbitrator Apophis saved Lin Li once by throwing Calamity out. However, in reality, everyone knew that if Apophis did not appear, Calamity would still be the one to be doomed, and the outcome would definitely be worse. Therefore, Linley did not show any surprise at the sudden appearance of Apophis, nor did he feel happy that he had survived as everyone thought. Back then, when Linley was first appointed as president, he was only an archmage, yet he had the audacity to burn Apophis' beard with fire. Now that he stepped into the sanctuary realm, he definitely didn't feel any fear when facing mythical figures. Linley didn't ask any questions, and simply expressed assent before leaving his seat. He walked towards Apophis, after which the two of them turned around and left while everyone watched. This is not real. It's an illusion. It must be. It was only when the figures of the two men completely disappeared from the hall that everyone finally heaved sighs of relief. However, they quickly became nervous again, especially the counselors, who were going against Linley just now. They could not believe it even though they saw it with their own eyes. It was extremely quiet, and even though Apophis spoke softly, every counselor heard it clearly. They clearly heard the godlike arbitrator Apophis saying the word, "we." Clearly, he was representing the three arbitrators. Of course, whether Linley was sheltered by one arbitrator or three, it didn't make much difference to those people. However, being received by three arbitrators at the same time was a very remarkable feat. Throughout the past 1,300 years since the establishment of the Supreme Council, only two people were known to have been received by the three arbitrators altogether. One was Pope Rosario of the Brilliant Shrine, while the other was the famous prophet Willin. The Brilliant Shrine was the only huge force in Anral that could be compared to the Supreme Council. As the Pope of the Brilliant Shrine, and a sanctuary powerhouse, Rosario was an elite of Anral, be it in terms of status or power. As for Prophet Willin, the son of the Holy Light, his identity was not inferior, either. It was said that he was once Apophis' opponent. Although no one saw the process of them fighting each other, Apophis repeatedly expressed the fact that Willin was stronger than him. When Pope Rosario of the Brilliant Shrine visited, he was received by the three arbitrators, after which the Supreme Council and the Brilliant Shrine jointly dealt with the black current of the Sunset Mountains. When Prophet Willin visited, he also received the same treatment from the three arbitrators, after which there was the suppression of the Retribution Knight in the Breezy Plains. Those two were big shots, who managed to effect two major events that decided the fate of Anral. What about Lin Li? In the opinion of the counselors, he was just the president of a faraway guild of magic and a newly minted counselor of the Supreme Council. They felt that his abilities were only that of 2 years in the legendary realm. Among the counselors who were pleasant, many of them felt that they were far stronger and more competent than Lin Li, the unknown small fry. However, it was often hard for them to meet an arbitrator, let alone three at the same time. Andoin did not expect Lin Li to be valued so greatly by the arbitrators, but, after all, he thought that it was a good thing. Hence, he wasn't too shocked, and quickly came back to his senses. Deputy Chairman Rosen, would you like to take this proposal back and think about it, or do you want to proceed to the voting session for it? However, it was different for Rosen, who had planned everything. Faced with the sudden change, he had no choice but to consider the relationship Linley had with the three arbitrators. If the relationship between the arbitrators and Linley was like someone who suddenly took an interest to an insignificant ant and paid attention to it, it wouldn't be too terrifying of a matter. Rosen was entirely confident that he would be able to make the arbitrators lose interest in that insignificant ant. However, was that really the case? Rosen was not blind or deaf. He had seen and heard everything clearly just now. Rosen could tell from arbitrator Apophis' attitude towards Linley just now that he was probably not just defending Linley out of a moment of interest, but rather he truly valued him. It was not the protection that a god would give to an insignificant ant, but the way an elder valued his junior. That was terrifying. If one were to kill a dog, They would probably just have to compensate the owner, and the matter would blow over easily, but if one killed someone else's child, the consequences would be unimaginable. Although Rosen did not want to believe it, he had to be careful. If it was true, he would be in dire straits. Vote. Hearing Andoin's question, Rosen could not help but feel vexed. Even if he had the bravery to continue pushing for the proposal, the final result of the vote would probably be the opposite of what he expected. Rosen looked up at the people in the hall, only to see that the councillors who had originally expressed their strong support for his proposal did not even dare to make eye contact with him now. Their eyes were shifty, and they had long been badly frightened. Even his loyal supporter, the high-ranking councillor Hubert, had turned pale. He looked like he was about to be frightened to death. In fact, not to mention the other councillors, even Rosen himself was feeling a dull pain in his palpitating chest. Since Felix has left, I think we'd better put this proposal aside for now. After the discussion, I, too, think that there are some issues in this proposal that we should study and investigate further. After some consideration, Rosen still decided to look at the situation before acting. The arbitrator was not someone he could offend. Oh, in that case, Councillor Hubert, Councillor Lettings, and the rest of you, what do you think? Andoin asked the councillors who had made a big deal out of the discussion earlier after glancing at Rosen. Canuman, who had been thrown out by Apophis, had yet to return to the hall. They had no idea if he was severely injured or simply too ashamed to enter, and thus left in advance. Having seen that example, Hubert and the rest naturally did not dare to speak up again. The main instigator, Rosen, had also mellowed down. After hearing Andoin's question, everyone shook their heads and waved their hands, appearing rather awkward as they continuously said that they had failed to consider the issue thoroughly. Outside the hall, Linley left together with Apophis, after which the two of them remained silent, almost walking side by side. They headed to the top floor of the Eternal Tower. Linley didn't see the situation inside the venue, but he could guess that Rosen and the rest had probably retreated since the arbitrator Apophis had appeared. They weren't fools, either. In fact, even if Apophis hadn't appeared, Linley wouldn't have taken it to heart. Although Canuman was a level 23 legendary mage, Linley could easily kill him. It would be much easier than crushing a bedbug. Linley also didn't mind being a little ruthless in the Eternal Tower. Apophis' appearance actually saved Canuman. Hence, after leaving the meeting, Linley put the matter regarding the proposal aside and stopped thinking about it. What really made him curious was still the invitation from the three arbitrators. What did they want to discuss with him? Although he had stepped into the sanctuary realm, Linley felt that there was a huge difference between his current strength and that of the three arbitrators. In terms of status, he was only a small president of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic, while the three arbitrators were the genuine supreme leaders of the Supreme Council. The difference in strength and status made it seem impossible for the three arbitrators and him to have something to discuss together. However, Linley didn't ask Apophis about it, since he would get an explanation and an answer for his doubts anyway. Besides, he could tell from Apophis and Chris' attitude that no matter what it was, it shouldn't be harmful to him. Hence, Linley didn't ask anything when he was following Apophis, and instead focused his attention on his surroundings, observing the layout of the floors in the Eternal Tower, while secretly comparing them to the Tower of Dusk. Although he had only taken quick glances, and thus the things he saw definitely were not comprehensive, as he only managed to see the superficial layout, Linley had to admit that the Supreme Council had a strong foundation and a massive amount of wealth. Indeed, the Tower of Dusk was far from comparable to it. After all, the Supreme Council had been in operations for thousands of years, and with the Eternal Tower being the core of the place, how could it be inferior? Besides, at the end of the Dark Age, they managed to acquire a large amount of wealth from the High Elves, and that was not something that could be compared to what little Linley had gained from exploring some secret places. The overall layout of the Eternal Tower seemed plain at first glance, as there were no ostentatious decorations, unlike the buildings of the High Elves that Linley had seen, which were extravagant and lavish. The walls and ground of the Eternal Tower were all made of natural wood, and gave off a comfortable and natural vibe. Of course, it was just a feeling. In fact, in the world of Anril, no material was more precious than the trunk of the Tree of Eternity. The Eternal Tower itself was built using half of the trunk of the Tree of Eternity. If magical gemstones and magical metals were added to it, it would just be extra. What attracted Linley the most was still the natural textures of the flooring and the walls. Linley was a guru of inscription, and he had personally stepped into the sanctuary realm as well. Hence, he had a deep understanding of the world laws. He could completely see that all of the natural textures contained pure laws, with each texture being a natural mageth. Each texture was a natural mageth, and they formed natural mageth arrays that grouped together to form a massive mageth array, which was beyond the guru level, and even Linley couldn't find out what its limits were. Linley could only sigh deep down. It was undoubtedly a miracle of the Tree of Eternity that created the High Elves and supported the world of Anral. At the same time, Linley had even greater expectations for the Tree of Eternity that was planted in the Tower of Dusk. The small sapling was gradually growing, and it would definitely bring the Tower of Dusk to an unreachable peak, allowing it to be a magical land of Anral. Finally, Linley arrived at the top of the Eternal Tower under Apophis' lead. To Linley's surprise, Chris, the arbitrator who had received him previously, was actually standing outside the door. Upon sight of Linley and Apophis, Chris smiled benevolently and affectionately said, "You're here, come in." After saluting and greeting him, Linley entered the room together with the two arbitrators. The room seemed to be a secret library that was filled with rows and shelves of books that were either old or new. In the middle of the shelves, there was a table which the other arbitrator, Megard, was seated in front of. At this moment, Megard was browsing a magical book with a black cover. When he heard Linley and the others enter, he finally looked up at them. Seeing that Megard was looking at him, Linley dared not procrastinate as he hurriedly greeted him respectfully with a bow. The three arbitrators were mythical figures who had followed Garesco and overthrown the High Elves dynasty together. Linley genuinely respected the three of them. Megard nodded without saying anything and simply put the magic book down gently. Apophis brought Linley to the table. He pointed at a chair in front of the table and smilingly said, "You must be wondering why the three of us asked you to come here. Take a seat. We'll talk about it slowly." "That's not appropriate. I'm a junior. How can I sit in front of the three of you?" Linley said, frantically declining. "Come on, kid, you weren't that polite when you were burning my beard. Just take a seat like I told you to," Apophis chided. He ran his hand through his regrown beard as he walked towards the chair beside him. Seeing that Apophis had said that, Linley didn't decline further. He decided to wait for Chris and Apophis to take their seats before pulling out the chair and sitting down. If others were to see that scene in the library, everyone would probably go mad. What a joke. What kind of figures were the three arbitrators? They were truly standing at the pinnacle of Anral, and every decision of theirs could affect the fate of the entire world. They were almost godly existences. Those who were qualified to sit in front of the three arbitrators were few and far between in Anral. Even the chairman and deputy chairman of the Supreme Council could often only stand and listen to their instructions. The Darkness Shrine could be considered second only to the Brilliant Shrine, and the third major force of Anral. High Priest Sendros, who was in charge of the Brilliant Shrine, was considered a figure who was at the pinnacle of power in the world of Anral. However, as long as one was not a sanctuary powerhouse, he would never have the right to sit down in front of the three arbitrators. The ones below the sanctuary realm were like insignificant ants, and that was absolutely true. It was a massive difference in life forms. Not to mention Sendros of the Darkness Shrine, even Pope Rosario of the Brilliant Shrine would not be qualified to sit down in front of the three arbitrators before he stepped into the sanctuary realm. As for Linley, the Tower of Dusk might be incomparable to the Brilliant Shrine and Darkness Shrine, and he might just be the president of a guild of magic and a newly minted counselor of the Supreme Council, but he had already stepped into the sanctuary realm. Although he had just become a sanctuary powerhouse, it meant that he had already advanced beyond the level of mortals. Although Linley was still far from the three arbitrators in terms of strength, he had broken free from his identity of an insignificant ant. It was just like a comparison between a child and an adult. Although there was a great difference in strength, they were both equally human and could no longer be considered as insignificant small fries. When Linley sat down, he obviously behaved properly. He placed his hands on his knees like he was seated decently. He looked at the three arbitrators and waited for them to reveal the reason that they had asked to see him. Apophis was much more relaxed and casual. He was seated sideways on the chair, facing Linley with one arm on the table. He gently knocked on the table with his fingers twice, and suddenly said, "Fulik, you're now a counselor of the Supreme Council, and you've attended 2 regular meetings. What is your opinion on the current Supreme Council?" Apophis' words were casual, but Linley got a great shock. What a joke. He was just a powerless counselor who was newly appointed and had only attended the Supreme Council twice. He was still an outsider to the Supreme Council. What thoughts could he possibly have? Since Apophis had asked that question, Linley had to answer. He simply laughed awkwardly and said, "The Supreme Council. I think it's great. Under the lead of you 3 arbitrators, the Supreme Council managed to develop to such a great scale. It has risen to the stage where it can control the fate of the entire Anral and guide the development of magic civilization. It definitely is the best it can be. Is that so?" Apophis immediately rolled his eyes when he heard Linley's answer. With a teasing look, he said, "Good, my foot. If it was that good, why would we have to fight with the breezy plains for the Terra mine?" Linley couldn't help but touch his nose and grin awkwardly without answering Apophis. After all, He was in the Supreme Council, where the three arbitrators were in charge. It was fine for Apophis to criticize it as much as he wanted, but Linley didn't think that he, too, could give any comment at will. Flick, you don't have to care about our pride. Go ahead and say what you want. We'd like to hear what the Supreme Council is like in the eyes of others, Arbitrator Chris said in a gentle tone, with a graceful smile on his face. Yes, don't feign ignorance. I don't believe that you can't see such an obvious problem, Apophis said while stroking his beard and glaring at Linley as if he wouldn't stop until he heard the truth. Linley could tell from Apophis' words that the three arbitrators actually knew of the problems with the Supreme Council. It was actually more like a test than a question. However, Linley couldn't understand what the problems of the Supreme Council had to do with him. He thought, since you're well aware, you can just go ahead and deal with it, can't you? Why do you still have to ask for my opinion? Given the status and abilities of you three arbitrators, it's up to you to do what you want to the Supreme Council. However, regardless of whether it was a question or a test, it didn't seem appropriate for Linley to keep mum now. Although the arbitrator Megard had been silent so far, Linley could tell that he seemed to be hoping for him to say something. Of course, Linley might have just been exposed to the problems of the Supreme Council, but he had plenty of thoughts in mind. Actually, the problems of the Supreme Council were very simple. Just like other forces and organizations that had been established for a long time, they were stagnating and lifeless. The Supreme Council, which had been established more than 1,300 years ago, was now like a pool of stagnant water. To put it bluntly, it had already declined. No matter what initial agenda the Supreme Council was established upon or the spirit it was supposed to have, the passage of time had gradually eroded it. In fact, it wasn't just the Supreme Council that was facing that problem. It was the same for the Brilliant Shrine. The Felon Kingdom and Leaden Kingdom had also gradually begun declining. Dynasties often changed because of that problem. Only the Darkness Shrine was showing some signs of vitality, after experiencing several ordeals and being under the lead of the Sendros. Since the three arbitrators had requested his answer, Linley could not bring himself to be perfunctory, and felt that he had to answer them. Hence, after some deliberation, he said, there seems to be a bit of a problem. According to what I know, the Supreme Council was initially established with the purpose of developing human magic civilization. However, the current Supreme Council seems to be a jaded authority. The struggle for power seems to have gradually replaced the original purpose of establishment of the Supreme Council. Linley carefully expressed his opinion, and he used the words, seems, and, a bit for the sake of the pride of the three arbitrators. He also paid attention to the expressions of the three arbitrators as he spoke. After all, by saying that, he seemed to be blaming the three of them. The Supreme Council had been active for more than 1,300 years, and the three arbitrators had always been the authoritative figures of the Supreme Council. They were definitely responsible for the development of the Supreme Council. Linley believed that Chris and Apophis wouldn't do anything to him because of that, but he was unsure about the cold and indifferent Megard, who had been keeping a straight face. Well, revered arbitrators, that's all I can think about now. Linley was secretly thankful that the expression of arbitrator Megard did not change throughout his speech. He even seemed to show a hint of recognition and appreciation for him. Rascal, are you still not going to be honest? Wrong is wrong, and right is right. Will it kill you to be a little more straightforward? The three of us haven't gotten to the point where we don't want to hear the truth, said Apophis, who was a genius and could naturally tell that Linley was not telling the truth, hence chiding him. I haven't been in contact with the Supreme Council for very long. I don't know much about it. I can't be certain that I'm right, so I was just voicing some of my opinions, Linley explained with an awkward smile. However, after Linley's defense, the three arbitrators appeared to be somewhat silent. Even Apophis didn't seem that casual anymore. The atmosphere in the room seemed somewhat austere. After a moment of silence, Apophis let out a long sigh. He looked at Chris and Megard before saying in a low voice, back then, Garesco led us to overthrow the High Elves and put an end to the Dark Age. We established the Supreme Council, and after thinking about it, it still feels like it happened yesterday. He gave the mages of Anril to us. We haven't let him down. We've been taking care of the miscellaneous affairs for him for 1,300 years. Although the current Supreme Council was helmed by the chairman and deputy chairman, and also had hundreds of counselors, the council would basically discuss and handle all matters as long as it was not a matter as major as the sky falling down. However, the Supreme Council was not established in a single day. The effort invested by the three arbitrators over the past 1,300 years was probably as painstaking as the effort they had put into overthrowing the High Elves. Linley could still understand that, after all, the Supreme Council managed the mages of the entire world, and every decision made by the Supreme Council would affect the entire Enril and the direction of development of human magic civilization. Even in the Tower of Dusk, Linley did not hand everything over to Gavin and the senior executives. There were still some matters that he had to deal with personally. If there were any problems in the Tower of Dusk, he would be the only one affected. If something were to happen to the Supreme Council, the impact would be major. However, we're not as sick as Garesco. After all, we can't be good at everything. The only one who's comparable to Garesco in this aspect has left long ago to become the High Priest of the Darkness Shrine. He's nowhere to be found. The three of us are the only ones left. Although we have invested plenty of energy, we've only barely managed to reach Garesco's original expectations. There was some regret in Apophis' tone, and he had no idea that Linley had seen Rog, and even had a long conversation with him. Hence, he only mentioned Rog casually. Linley knew that Apophis' words weren't exaggerated. After Rog became the High Priest of the Darkness Shrine, the Darkness Shrine reached their prime under his lead, and it could be considered a prosperous period. It even suppressed the Brilliant Shrine, and could vaguely compete with the Supreme Council. Unfortunately, when the Darkness Shrine's development was unstoppable, Rog fell into the Great Rift of the Eternal Darkness Altar, and was trapped in it for over 1,000 years, directly leading to the downfall of the Darkness Shrine. If Rog had still been in the Supreme Council, the Supreme Council would have probably been different under his management. However, it was clearly not the time for Linley to speak to the three arbitrators regarding the matter of Rog. Linley did not interrupt Apophis, and instead remained seated and listened to his story. We know very well about the problems you just mentioned, and we're also clear that you have held back many of your true thoughts. Indeed, the development of the Supreme Council has really deviated from the direction that Garesco had originally had in mind, especially in the last couple of hundred years. It's no longer like a shrine that leads the development of magic civilization. It's more and more like an organization with a power struggle, and every mage has become a politician. At this point, the expression on Apophis' face didn't change too much. There was merely a look of guilt and regret in his eyes. He seemed to be thinking of the time when he had established the Supreme Council with Garesco, as well as its development. You don't have to be too concerned. Actually, the Supreme Council isn't that bad now. Everyone can see its contribution to the development of magic civilization over the years. Seeing that Apophis seemed to be in low spirits, Linley could not help but persuade him. Apophis waved his hand and sneered. You don't need to speak up for them. Look at those people down there. None of them act like mages at all. All they do is fight for fame and benefits all day long by abusing their authority. However, the development of magic has always been stagnant. There isn't even a single one who has stepped into the sanctuary realm, let alone become like Garesco. Even the legendary realm has become an unattainable pinnacle. That's ridiculous, isn't it? At this point, Linley had no choice but to remain silent. That was indeed an unavoidable truth. Actually, the current environment for learning magic was much better, and allowed more freedom than that of the Dark Age during the High Elves' reign. Could it be that the magical talent of humans in this era was really inferior to the Dark Age? That was probably not the real reason. Garesco left a note on the cover of the Book of Eternity. Knowledge is the most devout faith of a mage. That sentence was actually not a secret. That famous quote could be found in the library of the Supreme Council, and many other libraries of guilds of magic. Almost every mage knew of that quote from Garesco, but those who could truly follow it were few and far between. Hence, it was no exaggeration to say that the mages of the modern era had lost the faith that mages ought to have in the desire for knowledge. Apophis let out a long sigh once again with some fatigue in his eyes. He calmly said, "We're all tired now. We've been managing these trivial matters for over 1,300 years. If it weren't for that jerk Garesco, who bothered us with these matters, we would have long been able to follow in his footsteps, and step into the highest realm of Anral." Over 1,300 years ago, the three arbitrators had already become sanctuary powerhouses, and could follow Garesco to the war that overthrew the High Elves. Clearly, their strength at that time was far beyond just entering the sanctuary realm. Even if they hadn't reached the peak of the sanctuary realm then, they probably hadn't been far behind. After all, their enemies were the powerful High Elves. The biggest reason that the three arbitrators had never taken the final step after all those years was that they were worried about the Supreme Council. One could imagine how the Supreme Council would shatter into bits and collapse before the enemies appeared without the three arbitrators. "This is why we're here to look for you." While Linley was being doubtful, and wondering what the matter had to do with him, Megard, who had been remaining silent, suddenly said those words. Upon hearing his words, Linley panicked, and he could vaguely sense the agenda of the three arbitrators who came to look for him. Indeed, before Linley could think, Megard said in a calm and steady tone, "We hope that you can succeed us, take over the Supreme Council, and become the manager of all mages in Anral." What, did I hear wrong? Linley simply couldn't help but feel like digging his ears. Was he out of his mind? Or were the three arbitrators crazy? Or had the entire world gone mad? Although he had just guessed a little bit, Linley still couldn't believe his ears after hearing Megard's words. The Tower of Dusk and the Supreme Council were completely different. The fact that the Tower of Dusk was being managed well did not mean that he could manage the Supreme Council too. It was just like making an archmage learn legendary level magic. It was a difference in realm, and not something that could be achieved with effort. Besides, the Tower of Dusk was being managed well, and Linley didn't want to take over the Supreme Council that was declining. The three arbitrators had not managed to set the Supreme Council on the right path, and Linley didn't think that he had the ability to do it, either. He reckoned that it would be impossible even if he were to toil until he vomited blood. Linley did not want to take on such a taxing task that wouldn't benefit him. Hence, he wouldn't consider much, and was about to turn them down. However, before Linley could speak, Megard seemed to have already predicted it as he raised his hand to stop him. He said, "Don't be so quick to refuse. Hear me out first. We have all thought of your concerns, and we don't mean to let you immediately take over the Supreme Council. Now, the three of us still have some energy. We can first help you lay the foundation. You have enough time to adapt, and when time is right, you can actually take over the Supreme Council." "That's not appropriate. I have neither seniority nor prestige and authority. I barely qualify for being a counselor. How can I manage the entire Supreme Council?" Even though Megard had said so, Linley was still a little unwilling. For ordinary people, the possibility of becoming an arbitrator and standing on the pinnacle of Anral was undoubtedly tempting. However, that was not all Linley pursued. Just like how the three arbitrators wanted to take the final step in the pursuit of magic, he was not satisfied with his mere entry to the sanctuary realm. Linley didn't have to do much for the Tower of Dusk, and he just needed to have enough strength to deter his enemies. He could leave the trivial and miscellaneous matters to his subordinates. Hence, Linley didn't have to invest too much energy in the management and operation of the Tower of Dusk. However, he couldn't do the same for the Supreme Council, especially since what the three arbiters wished for wasn't just to have a sanctuary powerhouse in charge. They wanted Linley to set the Supreme Council on the right track. Given the current condition of the Supreme Council, Linley would have plenty to do if he were to take on the task. The Supreme Council was already declining at the moment, and if he wanted to change the situation, he would first have to clean up the council, after which he had to poach some talents that he could bring to the council. He would then have to change the situation of the mages losing their faith. That was a long and massive process. In addition to that, there were all sorts of problems, and the mere thought of it gave Lin Li a terrible headache. If he were to really do it, it would kill him. The arbitrators looked at each other, not surprised by Lin Li's refusal at all. As sanctuary powerhouses, they naturally knew that the identity of an arbitrator of the Supreme Council seemed glorious to ordinary people, but to sanctuary powerhouses, it was more of a responsibility and trouble that they had been shouldering for more than 1,300 years. They definitely had stronger emotions about it than Lin Li. However, the three arbitrators had no other choice. Sanctuary powerhouses were not immortals, and if they never took the final step, they would eventually decay one day. If they didn't find a suitable successor, the Supreme Council would stray further away from the original intent. Once the three arbitrators passed away, in the end, they would collapse and face their end. I think Teacher Andoin would be more suitable than me. He's the chairman of the Supreme Council, who has experience in running it. Be it because of his seniority or prestige, he's more than qualified enough to take on that responsibility. Lin Li knew that it wasn't easy to directly decline. Hence, he recommended someone else to the three arbitrators. Him. The mention of that rascal makes me feel infuriated. Hearing Lin Li mention Andoin, Apophis was filled with resentment, and he started cursing in a hostile manner. We were initially quite optimistic, and had high expectations of that brat. Who knew that he would be so incompetent as to create a thorn domain for the sake of pharmaceutics? He will never, ever enter the sanctuary realm. Besides, with that ability of his, he can't even suppress that rascal Rosen. What happened today is an example. How can you expect him to lead the reform of the Supreme Council? Although Apophis was being a little extreme, Lin Li was well aware that with the thorn domain, the possibility of Andoin entering the sanctuary realm was almost zero. If Andoin could reach the guru level, he would be able to enter the sanctuary realm. However, that was not possible. With Andoin's subpar standards in pharmaceutics, it was even more unreliable than him taking the path of magic. Fulik, the three of us have already discussed the issues of seniority and prestige previously. We've come to a consensus and made an arrangement. Arbitrator Chris was a little embarrassed when he said those words because everyone could tell that Lin Li was just making excuses when he talked about seniority and prestige. However, he still had to say it despite being embarrassed. He couldn't watch the Supreme Council get destroyed in his hands. Chris sighed and said to Lin Li, "If you're willing, you will be the fourth arbitrator of the Supreme Council. However, we won't be announcing this news to the world for now. You'd better participate in the management of the Supreme Council as a counselor first. Linley remained silent, and did not immediately nod, or continue to refuse. After all, the 3 arbitrators were nice to him when he was still an archmage. Apophis had personally given him some pointers in magic. If it were someone else, it would be impossible. Although Megard was cold and indifferent on the surface, he allowed Lin Li to take away the core crystal coffin of the Eternal Furnace, because he had discovered that Lin Li owned the Eternal Furnace after the exploration of Ozark's mausoleum. In the end, the arbitrator Chris personally received and brought him to the Supreme Council. He also gave him some pointers about the Sanctuary Realm. Hence, despite knowing that the task was troublesome, Linley did not refute immediately, and instead listened to Chris' arrangements patiently. If the trouble was still within his means, Linley wouldn't mind helping the 3 arbitrators once. Well, he was young after all. Sensing that Linley's attitude seemed to have eased up, Chris continued, "Once you have accumulated sufficient prestige, I will announce this news, and you will then start the reform of the Supreme Council as an arbitrator. Don't worry, we aren't going to just walk away and leave you in the lurch. We will still continue to support you during the reform until you completely control the situation. We will then leave. Flick, we also know that this matter is indeed a big trouble for those who have stepped into the Sanctuary Realm, but it has been many years, and the 3 of us have yet to nurture a decent successor, so we can't just watch the Supreme Council be destroyed like this." Seeing that Linley was silent, Apophis tried to persuade him again. "Apophis, don't speak. Let Flick think for himself." Although Megard was speaking in a calm tone, there was still some anticipation in his eyes. After all, he had been at the peak of the Sanctuary Realm for years, and everyone wanted to take the final step to truly become an immortal god. The world always envied the 3 arbitrators for standing at the pinnacle of authority, but they did not know that the power they had was actually a huge burden to them. If they had not been held down and restrained by the Supreme Council, they would have probably long become immortal gods with their magical talent. After a moment of silence, Linley finally nodded slowly while the 3 arbitrators watched him. "All right, since the 3 arbitrators have so much trust in me, I'll go ahead with this arrangement and do my best." Fin the new street ovals on in, Velben, calm. Seeing that Linley finally nodded, the 3 arbitrators were secretly relieved. Although the arrangements had yet to be implemented, and they did not know when Linley was truly capable of taking over the Supreme Council, they already felt a little relieved. It was a feeling that they had not felt for a long time. Linley didn't know much about the Supreme Council yet, hence, he stood up to bid farewell to the 3 arbitrators after a simple conversation. When Linley was about to leave, Apophis suddenly stopped him. "By the way, if anyone mentions the Terra Mine again, tell them to come to me." Linley nodded and turned around to leave the library. He thought to himself, at least Rosen and those guys are only coveting the Terra Mine. Yet, these 3 are even more ruthless. They actually want to take me and the mine together. It wasn't unreasonable for Linley to think this way. If he were to really take over the Supreme Council in the future, his resources would all have to be used on the Supreme Council. With mixed emotions and thoughts, Linley made his way out of the venue. After all, to the outsiders, he was still just an insignificant counselor who had to attend the meeting of the Supreme Council. When he was outside the venue, Linley could still hear the noises coming from inside. However, they fell silent once he entered. All eyes were on Linley, and they watched as he entered the venue before walking back to his seat in the corner. From the moment Linley was taken away by the arbitrator, Apophis, everyone made speculations and guesses about him incessantly. They were making guesses about what the arbitrators wanted to see him for, and what made him different from them so much that the 3 arbitrators asked to see him at once. In fact, regardless of what the 3 arbitrators were looking for Linley for, they could tell from the fact that Apophis had thrown Canuman out without asking any questions that they had some intention of defending Linley. Canuman had a high status in the Supreme Council, and was a high-ranking counselor. His status was definitely far beyond that of a small, newly minted counselor. Hence, no one dared to regard Linley as a mere newly minted counselor anymore. At this moment, Lettings was also feeling extremely uneasy, feeling like he was sitting on needles. He could clearly feel that there was resentment in the gazes of the counselors who he had colluded with when they looked at him now. Clearly, they resented him for implicating them and getting them into trouble. Lettings was actually disappointed. Ever since Linley had left, he could have just acted like nothing had happened. Unfortunately, he had believed his student Joso's words. For the sake of getting acquainted with Deputy Chairman Rosen, he went around trying to contact a few friends and roped them in to join the boycott against Linley. Great. No matter how authoritative Deputy Chairman Rosen was, he definitely wasn't more powerful than the arbitrators. Lettings was filled with regret, and he was only wishing for the meeting to end quickly so that he could teach his troublemaking student a lesson. Of course, Letting still didn't know that the genius student of his was still passing off as a statue on the pathway in front of the library for the viewing pleasure of visitors. Linley walked to his seat in the corner, and was about to sit down, but then he stopped and looked up. He then said to everyone, "By the way, Arbitrator Apophis said that anyone who's interested in the Terra mine can go speak to him." He then looked at Rosen and the others before sitting down again, waiting for the meeting to continue with a calm expression. As soon as Linley said those words, all the counselors who were going all out to push for the proposal, including Rosen, instantly felt their bodies turning numb. They broke out in a cold sweat, and if it weren't for the fact that they were seated on chairs, they would have fainted. Apophis was obviously defending Lin Li. It was no longer an issue about the Terra mine. Anyone who was not a fool would be able to tell that he meant that anyone who dared to go against Lin Li and the Tower of Dusk would first have to seek Apophis' permission. When Rosen was seated, he felt extremely dizzy. Not only did they fail to reap any benefits from the proposal, they even suffered a huge blow. He could imagine that more than half of the counselors who'd initially stood on his side would definitely stop supporting him after this matter, and that was a slightly more optimistic prediction. Deputy Chairman Rosen, now that Councillor Flick is back, are you going to continue with the voting for the proposal? Although Anduin wasn't sure what the three arbitrators had discussed with Lin Li, it didn't prevent him from rubbing another pinch of salt into Rosen's wounds. Upon hearing him mention the proposal, Rosen and the counselors on his side almost shivered at the same time. To them, the proposal was no longer something that could bring them massive benefits. Instead, it was something that would bring them infinite fear. What a joke. Why would we mention the Terra mine again? It'd be no different from courting death. Although Rosen's heart was filled with resentment, he did not show it at all. He said in a shaky voice, "Chairman Anduin has spoken. Clearly, Councillor Flick and Arbitrator Apophis have already come up with a plan to deal with the issue of the Terra mine. We won't bother with it uselessly here anymore." It was definitely not a good feeling to have to take back one's words and withdraw one's plan after making a huge fuss out of it. However, Rosen didn't have any other choice. Besides, it was obvious that the other counselors wouldn't be willing to die with him even if he insisted on proceeding to the voting process to reach an outcome. "All right then, let's discuss the following proposal," said Anduin. He was, after all, unlike Rosen. Although he was not benevolent, and was not giving in, either, he could not be bothered to provoke the disoriented and dejected Rosen any further. Although he said that they were going to discuss a new proposal, no one in the room was enthusiastic. In fact, they even vaguely felt oppressed. Rosen and the other counselors on his side were not the only ones. Anduin's supporters, as well as some counselors who were in neutral positions, were the same. They had yet to fully recover from the shock they had just experienced. Everyone in the conference hall was thinking about the matter regarding Lin Li and the arbitrator. No one was in the mood to discuss meaningless proposals, though the proposals were at least related to the rise and fall of a nation in the eyes of ordinary people. In particular, the counselors who'd supported the proposal just now were extremely anxious. Everyone was thinking about how they could salvage the situation and improve their image in Lin Li's eyes. They couldn't blatantly suck up to him. They at least couldn't be remembered by Lin Li. Still, Lin Li was just a newly promoted counselor, and hadn't come up with any proposals that they could support. Hence, it would be difficult for them to cozy up to him, even if they wanted to. However, the counselors soon thought of another solution. Although most of them didn't know what relationship Lin Li and Anduin had, they could tell from the matter of Rosen's proposal that Anduin was clearly on Lin Li's side. Hence, there was a phenomenon in the conference hall where any proposal supported by the people on Anduin's side would immediately be supported by the majority, including the ones on Rosen's side. On the other hand, if those on Anduin's side opposed the proposal, it would also be immediately opposed by the majority. That allowed the meeting to proceed quickly. Basically, there wasn't much of a discussion before a proposal was quickly passed or rejected. Upon seeing the situation, Rosen's mood naturally worsened, and he sat gloomily in the deputy chairman's seat. He had no choice but to decline to comment on any proposal. He had no other option. He knew that his prestige had been reduced greatly, and he could not fight with Anduin at all. Of course, that was only temporary, and it did not mean that it was really over for Rosen. However, he felt temporarily demoralized because the counselors were still shell-shocked because of Apophis. The meeting finally came to an end amidst the bizarre yet harmonious atmosphere. Rosen, Hubert, and some others were the first to leave the meeting. After so many years of management, he still had a few loyal followers, and the other counselors seemed rather troubled too. They even couldn't recall the content of the proposals. Linley didn't leave early, but waited until Anduin, Aldwin, and the rest appeared to go over. They then chatted while leaving the venue. Although Anduin and the rest were curious, they tacitly chose not to probe. Instead, they talked about the reactions of Rosen and the rest. Seeing that Rosen, Linley, and Andoin had left. Lettings stood up with wobbling legs before dragging his heavy feet across to leave the venue. His friends were implicated in the matter because of him, and he ought to be lucky that they didn't come to settle the scores. They left without him long ago. Along with the crowd, Lettings made his way out of the venue dejectedly. He tried to find his direction, and was about to return to his residence when he saw an archmage rushing over. "Counselor Lettings?" the archmage asked. Lettings nodded, still dumbfounded. Although he was a little confused by Lettings' behavior, the archmage nonetheless continued to speak after verifying his identity. "Your student Joso has been confined outside the library all day. It was like a bolt out of the blue, which made Lettings feel giddy all of a sudden. He staggered forwards and almost fell down. At this moment, Lettings really wanted to strangle Joso with his own hands. With the experience he had the day before, he reckoned that his disciple had undoubtedly provoked the greenhorn newly minted Counselor Flick. "Damn it, I was just thinking about how I could salvage the situation, but that bastard Joso created trouble again." "Counselor Lettings, are you alright? Your student has merely been confined and restrained. He's not harmed in any way. You don't need to be too anxious." The archmage who reported the news thought that Lettings was being worried about his student, and thus tried to calm him. "Damn it, I'd rather that bastard just die." Lettings tried hard to calm down, and he said to the archmage, "I'm sorry to trouble you to make a trip. Let that incompetent rascal stand there for a while." "Ha!" The archmage who reported the news soon reacted. By the time he did, he only saw Lettings fading back. For some reason, he felt that it was filled with dejection and sorrow. Joso was not the only one. The teachers of Joso's underlings had also made the same choice as Lettings after getting a clear idea of the matter. In the end, Joso and his underlings could only continue to stand on the road in front of the library's main entrance while others pointed at them and made remarks about them. 3 days later, the restraining force on Joso and the rest finally disappeared, and the statues that had been on display for 3 days were suddenly paralyzed after falling onto the ground like mud. Even an archmage would definitely suffer detrimental effects after staying in the same position for 3 days without eating or drinking. What on earth had happened? Why didn't teacher rescue me? Joso was first bewildered, but he was soon filled with resentment instead. Although he couldn't speak, he was hollering in his heart, "Flick, I swear, I will not let you go. Soon, I'll show you the consequences of angering me." Joso and the others lay on the ground for a long time, but no one paid any attention to them. Everyone knew by now that they had to have provoked a big shot. Otherwise, their teachers wouldn't have punished them that way. Hence, everyone chose to shun them in fear. No one would bother helping them. After lying on the ground for half a day, Joso finally recovered from the shock. He got up and swayed unsteadily before returning to his teacher Lettings' residence. He initially thought that his teacher had to have been busy with something, or getting busy with distributing the fortune of the Tower of Dusk, and thus didn't have the time to care about him. Although that explanation was a bit far-fetched, he didn't believe that something would go wrong, since they were very confident about the matter. However, what Joso didn't expect was that his teacher, Lettings, was right at his residence, and he hadn't gone anywhere at all. That situation was confusing to him, but he couldn't be bothered to think. As soon as he saw Lettings, he exclaimed with anger and grief, "Teacher, you must do me justice. That bastard Flick." Before Joso could finish his sentence, Lettings rushed towards the front and gave Joso a hard slap. He angrily cursed, "You incompetent bastard, how dare you call me your teacher?" Joso had been confined for 3 days and 3 nights without food or water. He was extremely exhausted, and to make matters worse, he had to suffer the criticism and gossiping of others. To someone who had always considered himself to be heaven's favorite, it was an absurd insult and humiliation. The reason that the arrogant and prideful Joso didn't lose his mind was that he still had faith in Rosen's proposal. It made him feel that Flick wouldn't be able to be cocky for long. He spent every moment thinking about how he was going to deal with the enemy who had humiliated and embarrassed him. However, the slap from his teacher Lettings made him dumbfounded, and he also had an ominous hunch. Back when he had returned from Deputy Chairman Rosen's place and informed his teacher of the news, his teacher praised him, and even said that he could feel free to hand over the Supreme Council to him in the future. Yet, why did things change all of a sudden? Teacher, why? Joso clutched his face with fear and confusion in his eyes. He could not understand how his teacher's attitude towards him had changed so much in just 3 days. "Why? How dare you ask me why? How many times have I told you not to create trouble for me outside? Did you hear what I said? Do you still have any regards for me, your teacher?" Lettings was so infuriated that he was trembling from head to toe. Of course, it was also possible that he was scared. After all, there was an arbitrator protecting Lin Li. However, Joso had no idea, because he had stood outside the library for 3 days and 3 nights, and no one had said anything to him about what happened at the meeting. However, he could tell from his teacher's tone that something seemed to have gone wrong. He asked in disbelief, "Teacher, Did something happen? Could it be that Deputy Chairman Rosen's proposal didn't go through? You actually have the nerve to bring that up. Do you still have any regard for me, as a teacher? Lettings waved his hand, but it didn't land on Joso's face. Instead he pointed at Joso. Looking like he had expected better from him, he sternly hollered, "If you hadn't run off to look for Rosen on your own, would I have been put in such a passive position? When we go back, you'd better stay put in the guild obediently. If I find out that you've gone out to make trouble again, I'll take it that I've never had a student like you." How can that be? Impossible. Hasn't Deputy Chairman Rosen already confirmed that he would have more than half of the councillors supporting him? Despite not getting a clear answer, Rosen could still tell the root of the problem after hearing his teacher's words. However, that left him in greater disbelief. He was well aware of the situation, and with the support of more than half of the councillors, even the chairman wouldn't have the power to oppose the proposal and stop it from being passed. No matter how he looked at it, there shouldn't have been a problem. However, Lettings snorted and turned around to take a seat on a chair beside him. He finally slowly said, "Half? So what if all the councillors support him? Can their decision outweigh that of the arbitrator?" A arbitrator. The news was like a thunderbolt that struck Joso. When he heard it, he fell on the ground and began muttering in shock. Impossible. How can that be? Everyone knew that in the Supreme Council, it was still the three arbitrators who really had the power to make the final decision. The chairman and deputy chairman were just like butlers. No matter how much they argued, they would never have more power than the arbitrators. However, the arbitrators were godlike figures, and legendary powerhouses were like insignificant ants to them. How could they have suddenly intervened with the matters of the insignificant ants? Why not? If you can step into the legendary realm in your 20s, you might be valued by the arbitrators as well. Unfortunately, think about it, you've been doing nothing except causing trouble every day since you reached level 19. Since when have you ever studied magic properly and behaved yourself? You don't even have any hopes of entering the legendary realm. What's there for you to be proud of? Do you think you're invincible just because you've defeated a few archmages? Lettings barked in anger. Regardless of his infuriation, Joso was still his student, who had great talent in magic. There was hope of him entering the legendary realm. Yes, teacher, I'll definitely step into the legendary realm. Joso crouched on the ground with his head lowered and his fists clenched. There was a trace of indignation in his eyes. However, he knew that it was simply impossible for him to take revenge this time, because Linley was protected by the arbitrator. Okay, good that you have that determination. The matters here have been settled. It's time for us to go back, Lettings said with fatigue. Joso didn't have time to rest that day. Lettings took his proud disciple with him, and quietly left the Sky Garden without bidding farewell to anyone. He had no choice, since Lettings' friends still blamed him for implicating them. At least for now, no one wanted to see him. After the regular meeting, Linley didn't head back to the Tower of Dusk immediately, and instead stayed behind for a few more days in the Sky Garden. On one hand, he wanted to learn more about the Supreme Council through Andoin's introductions. After all, even if his identity as the fourth arbitrator was still kept a secret, there was plenty for him to learn and understand as a newly promoted counselor. On the other hand, he wanted to ask the three arbitrators for some advice about the Sanctuary Realm. The three of them were sanctuary powerhouses, who were extremely experienced in the Sanctuary Realm. Although Linley had Garesco's Book of Eternity, he could not find all the answers he needed in books. The three arbitrators each had different understanding and experience of the Sanctuary Realm, and their paths might deviate from or even go against the path that Linley was going to take. However, to Linley, they were good examples to learn from and great additions to the experience mentioned in the Book of Eternity. The three arbitrators, especially Apophis and Chris, had a good impression of Linley. They wanted Linley to help them shoulder the responsibility of the Supreme Council. It could be said that they treated Linley like their successor, hence, they naturally spared no effort in answering questions. However, Linley still had to manage the Tower of Dusk, after all, and his identity as the fourth arbitrator still had to be kept a secret. Hence, he couldn't make it too obvious. Just like the other counselors who attended the meeting, he felt that it was time to leave after staying in the Sky Garden for another 10 days. A few days of studying definitely didn't allow Linley to make an obvious breakthrough in level. The Sanctuary Realm was the process of a human transforming into a god. The difference between each rank was enormous. Linley's combat power was definitely stronger than that of the average newbie in the Sanctuary Realm, since he had the 7 pieces of the debris of the stars. However, in order to advance in level, he would have to rely on studying and accumulating experience. No matter how talented he was in magic, he still needed a long period of time. However, the interaction that he had with the arbitrators over the past few days allowed Linley to have a clearer understanding of the Sanctuary Realm. With the pointers of the three arbitrators, Linley felt like he had cleared many of his doubts. Hence, although Linley's level was still the same, some of the problems that he might encounter on the path in the sanctuary realm in the future had been removed, thus making his journey much smoother. On the day of his departure, Linley bade farewell to the three arbitrators, and met with President Joey and President Honor. Mason and Oren, who had been studying in the core library, had also left on that day. They were preparing to return to their respective guilds of magic with their teachers. Ha ha, Flick. Look at me. How do I look? I'm already a level 17 archmage now. I'm one big step closer to the legendary realm. The core library is impressive. I learned so many new things. As soon as Mason saw Linley, he rattled on incessantly without hiding his excitement. Idiot, you're daydreaming again, Oren, who stood beside him, said in a cold voice, not saving him any face. You, HMPH, I can't be bothered to talk to you. Why don't we have a contest to see who can step into the legendary realm first? Mason had advanced by a level in the core library, but he didn't expect Oren to have advanced by a level as well, thus suppressing him. The two of them had studied in the core library for the past several days, and each of them had advanced by one level. However, it wasn't because the core library was so magical that it allowed them to advance effortlessly by a level in a few days. It was mainly because they were both talented in magic. When they reached Joso's age, they might not necessarily be inferior to him in terms of strength. The two of them already had a certain amount of accumulation in their respective levels, and even if they hadn't studied in the core library, they would have definitely advanced in a year or two. The true value of the studying they had done over the past days was actually a proper guide to their future path in the pursuit of magic, similar to the guidance that the three arbitrators had given Linley. Of course, whether or not they could enter the legendary realm in the future was still dependent on the effort they put in. However, no matter what, Honor and Joey were naturally elated after seeing their students advancing in level by an obvious margin. They kept thanking Linley. Mason's teacher, Joey, was particularly grateful. Due to his inability to step into the legendary realm, the Chevan City Guild of Magic was now reduced to the point where even pirates dared to bully them. If it wasn't for the deterrence of the Supreme Council, he wouldn't even be able to continue living in Chevan City. Hence, Joey pinned all his hopes on Mason, hoping that he would one day step into the legendary realm and make the Guild of Magic prosper again. With Mason's current strength after advancing and taking another step towards the legendary realm, Joey was naturally overjoyed. In fact, the situation that Joey was facing in the Guild of Magic of Chevan City was the same as Honor's Guilds of Magic in Rotterdam. However, due to the fact that Honor had entered the legendary realm not long ago, their situation became a little better. That was one of the problems that the three arbitrators and Linley had talked about before. Magic civilization seemed to be thriving in Anril as there was an increased number of people wanting to learn magic. However, the quality was getting worse and worse compared to the Dark Age. After more than 1,300 years of development, not only had there been no new sanctuary mage, the legendary realm had even become the pinnacle of magic in the opinion of many. It was undoubtedly a devastating thing. Linley couldn't care less about that problem now. If it had been easy to solve, the three arbitrators would have already done it. Hence, he only replied to Joe's and Honor's thanks out of courtesy. He then walked to the teleportation portal while chatting with them. When Linley came, it was Arbitrator Chris who brought him to the Sky Garden using space magic. The space magic for transmission could only be cast by sanctuary powerhouses. The other counselors would still have to rely on the 4 fixed teleportation magic spells to get to and from the Sky Garden. Linley himself had learned that magic spell, and with his understanding of the debris of the stars, nothingness, and the space laws in his space robe, he still had no major problems using it. However, since he could use legendary level teleportation arrays, he didn't bother putting in the effort. Apart from the counselors who had specifically targeted Linley and the Tower of Dusk during the meeting, and left early for fear of retaliation from Linley, just like Lettings, the rest only left now. It was mainly because they wanted to let themselves and their students stay in the Supreme Council's library to study for a few more days. The 4 teleportation portals corresponded to 4 cities located in the Felon Kingdom. Lin Li and company were headed to the teleportation portal that led to the Alana Guild of Magic. The other counselors who lived far away from the Alana Guild of Magic would choose other teleportation portals. Previously, Linley had learned that the Chevan City, where Mason lived, was being attacked by a group of pirates and had to rely on the support of the new Crescent City Guild of Magic to barely persist. At that time, Linley had said that he could support the Chevan City Guild of Magic with a few magical crystal cannons and a batch of magical crystals. There would be absolutely no problem for the magical crystal cannons to attack the pirates. The ships on the sea were not as flexible as humans, and even humans couldn't escape the attacks launched by the magical crystal cannons, let alone the pirate ships. Mason originally thought that Linley had only said those words to provoke Joso, and thus did not mention it to his teacher, Joey. After all, he knew that each magical crystal cannon was worth hundreds of thousands of gold coins, and the gift of a few magical crystal cannons, plus a batch of magical crystals was something that guilds of magic could not just give away freely. As the headquarters of all guilds of magic, the Alana Guild of Magic could afford that batch of supplies and resources, but they would definitely be reluctant to give it away, not to mention the Tower of Dusk that had just been established a few years ago. However, Lin Li was mentioning that matter to Mason's teacher, President Joey. At this moment they would be heading to the Alana Guild of Magic, and there were magical crystal cannons and magical crystals in Lin Li's Ring of Endless Storm. Hence, there was no need for Lin Li to move them over from the breezy plains at all. He could just let President Joey bring the things back this time. At first, Mason was still worried about how he should explain this to his teacher. After all, it was because of him that the new Crescent City might stop providing aid. However, when Linley mentioned this issue again, Mason and Oren finally realized that he hadn't been kidding earlier on. President Joey knew that the Tower of Dusk possessed the Terra Mine, which was bringing it almost endless wealth. However, he was still very shocked that Linley could offer such a generous amount of supplies to aid Chevan City for free, all because he had been roommates with Mason before. President Joey didn't know Linley well, but he knew that the arbitrator wouldn't think highly of a nobody. He also knew the situation his faction was in now, so he didn't reject any further, and thanked Linley continuously while forcing down his immense joy. Just as Linley was talking with them, while walking slowly towards the teleportation portal, hundreds of translucent organisms suddenly shot down from the skies at the edge of the Sky Garden. These organisms looked like crystal-clear water balls, making light refract upon passing through them. Some of them landed on the teleportation portal. A bright light shone from the portal, and the portal was destroyed instantly following a loud explosion. For most of these translucent organisms, they changed their direction immediately upon landing, and rushed towards the mages closest to the teleportation portal. In the process of shooting down, these organisms' bodies had changed into almost human-like figures by the time they got close to the mages. Joey and Honor gasped, "It's the Calamity. Why is it happening now?" After coming to the Sky Garden these few days, Lin Li had quite a bit of understanding of the Supreme Council now. The Calamity that Macklin had talked about wasn't actually a natural disaster, but rather these translucent organisms invading the Sky Garden, the souls of the dead that the High Elves had left behind. This Sky Castle had originally belonged to the High Elves. Although Garesco had snatched it and wiped out all the High Elves in the city, there were still many High Elven souls of the dead left behind. These souls of the dead had already lost their sense of identity, and had forgotten the pride and honor that belonged to the High Elves. They hid all around the Sky Castle out of instinct. These souls of the dead were extremely different from vengeful spirits. They didn't possess a strong death aura, and were actually products of the High Elves' unwavering will and blood power. The way they accumulated strength was also not through engulfing soul fire like the undead creatures, but rather through converting the omnipresent magical elements into their own mana, just like mages. Whenever these souls of the dead had accumulated enough strength, they were driven by their instinct to attack the Sky Garden. For the past 1,300-odd years, the attacks had never ceased. This had caused huge damage to the Supreme Council initially, and thus the mages called it the Calamity. After some time, the Supreme Council gradually figured out the patterns behind their attacks. Thus, they made preparations before each attack and reduced the losses to a minimum. The Calamity was even used as a trial for the mages in the Supreme Council. It was for this reason that the three arbitrators didn't step in and destroy these souls of the dead completely. However, the timing of this Calamity seemed to have disregarded the patterns that the Supreme Council had found out. Its scale was also larger than those recorded in history, almost similar in intensity as the first few times. Out of the souls of the dead, there were tens of legendary level ones, and the rest were all approaching legendary level. Souls of the dead lower than legendary level didn't really pose a threat. The fact that it was called a Calamity was because of the legendary level souls of the dead, who had inherited all the merits of the High Elves. Although they had lost their bodies, they could now use nomological power with greater ease than before. Although these legendary level souls of the dead were similar in strength compared to mages of the same level, they could integrate themselves into the world's rules. That was already a sanctuary level ability, the only difference was in the level of strength. Thus, a legendary level mage was no match for a legendary level soul of the dead at all. If the counselors of the Supreme Council hadn't left, there would probably have been enough people to deal with a Calamity of such scale. However, many counselors had left one by one. The remaining counselors had almost all chosen various teleportation portals based on their needs, so the strength of the council had been spread out. Like wolves eyeing their prey, the souls of the dead swarmed towards the mages standing closest to the teleportation portals. Even when facing archmages who were relatively lower in power, the souls of the dead didn't give them any chance. Standing in front of Lin Li were the counselors from Rosen's faction and their students. Although they hadn't made their opinions known directly during the meeting like Lettings and Candyman, so they didn't need to worry about Lin Li revenging them, they still felt nervous that they were standing so close to Lin Li, and wanted to leave immediately. However, those counselors didn't expect the Calamity to come just as they were about to step into the teleportation portal. Those counselors were all legendary mages, so they reacted speedily and used defense magic to protect themselves. However, their students weren't so fast. Of course, it was evident what the outcome would be for an archmage when facing the combined attack of several legendary level souls of the dead and many more level 18 or 19 ones, whether or not he was prepared. The archmages following their teachers didn't even have time to shriek before being engulfed by the swarm. Meanwhile, their teachers could only watch their prideful students being engulfed by the swarm helplessly since they were struggling to protect even themselves. In fact, they didn't manage to sustain for long, either. In less than a second, the legendary level souls of the dead had penetrated the elemental shields of these level 20 or 21 legendary mages. For Lin Li and Joey, these high elven souls of the dead didn't even stop at all from invading the Sky Garden, destroying the teleportation portals, and engulfing the legendary mages and their students to pouncing towards them. Joey and his team were stunned, and their faces turned pale, especially after seeing those in front of them being engulfed by the souls of the dead almost instantly. Joey was only a level 19 archmage, while Honor had just reached Legendary Realm not long ago. With their knowledge of Lin Li, he had only reached Legendary Realm 2 or 3 years ago. As such, Joey thought that his team's power was similar to those in front of them. Even though they had a bit more time to react, that wouldn't change the outcome. Just then, the alarm in the Sky Castle rang. The mages at all places rushed towards the Sky Garden to help. However, being the Sky Castle of the High Elves, the Sky Garden was so vast that the mages could only arrive in a few minutes at their maximum speed. Meanwhile, at the Eternal Tower, Chairman Andoin and Deputy Chairman Rosen had also gotten the news of the Calamity. After knowing that the location of the attack was at the teleportation portal to Alana Guild of Magic, Andoin didn't dare to hesitate even a second. When Linley had come to bid farewell just now, Andoin had heard him say that he would be going to the Alana Guild of Magic. Given that not a long time had passed, Andoin was almost certain that Linley was among those facing the attack. Rosen had the same guess as Andoin. He was even a little glad at this news, hoping that the souls of the dead could kill Linley. However, he didn't want the arbitrators to think that Linley's death was due to his incapability in rescuing him. Andoin and Rosen held their magic staffs and flew in Linley's direction. When they arrived, the high elven souls of the dead had just engulfed those counselors and were rushing towards Linley and his companions. Seeing the power of those souls of the dead, Andoin got more anxious. Although he knew that Linley was stronger than he was, there were dozens of legendary souls of the dead in this swarm. These souls of the dead were skilled at group attacks. Even a mage at the peak of legendary level couldn't take the combined attack of dozens of legendary level souls of the dead. Although Rosen was rather disappointed that Linley was still alive now, he hid his disappointment deep in his heart and pretended to be very anxious. When he saw the swarm of souls of the dead pouncing towards Linley, a glimmer of hope arose in him again. After numerous calamities, there shouldn't be more than 10 legendary level souls of the dead in total, while those approaching legendary level should be around 100-200. However, their numbers had more than doubled in this calamity. In the face of a calamity of such scale, even Rosen was shocked. He couldn't think of any that matched the scale of this one. Those legendary level souls of the dead made use of their high integration of nomological power, making them almost incarnations of the rules themselves. This was unmatched by any legendary mage of the same level. Rosen speculated that even if Andoin and he rushed over to help, they would most likely not be able to match these legendary souls of the dead. With the swarm of souls of the dead rushing over like the tides, Lin Li and his companions would be engulfed instantly. Nobody would be able to save them. Nobody. Although Joey and Honor had already cast their strongest defense spells, every one of them could clearly feel how fragile their defense was in face of these souls of the dead. It was like a bubble that could be easily popped. Any legendary level soul of the dead couldn't be dealt with easily with Joe's and Honor's power, not to mention a swarm of them. Evrion's face turned as pale as a sheet because they knew they had slim chances of escaping this time. Meanwhile, Linley didn't cast any defense magic. Instead, he gently lifted his hand and pointed towards a spot of nothingness. Almost instantly, those aggressive souls of the dead, as well as the spells the mages were casting, froze into stillness. Maybe it was a second, or even less than that, but Joey and Honor all felt as if their hearts had stopped beating for a long time. They could clearly see those souls of the dead's twisted and hideous faces, outside of the magic shields as well as their claw marks left on the magic shields. Next, the mana wave around Lin Li's body, that seemed so insignificant just a moment before suddenly erupted like a volcano. The mana waves rushed out in all directions, and even the space around started to bend. No one could describe how powerful it was, because its power had gone beyond the limits of their imagination. It was like looking at the peak of a mountain from the foot, but only seeing the mist surrounding the mountainside. With the mana waves, an extremely glorious, sacred, and powerful aura compressed this space. At that moment, Joey even saw fear on the grimacing faces of the souls of the dead. After that, the souls of the dead, who had just engulfed several legendary mages and archmages, seemed to have experienced some great pulling force from their surroundings. They couldn't let out a sound, but shrieks of pain had already overwhelmed the depths of their souls. 1. It's polite in China to reject favors, and such once or twice first, so the author probably implies this. All the souls of the dead were shredded into pieces by a terrifying and intangible power instantaneously, and then into smaller pieces until they disappeared from the world. If not for the destroyed teleportation portal and dried up corpses from earlier on, everyone would think that this was just a nightmare they had dreamed. Andoin and Rosen, who had come to rescue Lin Li's team, immediately collapsed to the ground at the moment Lin Li released the groundbreaking aura. The aura annulled their power of flight, and they almost felt as if it was blasphemy to use the power of flight in front of Linley. While others might not know why, Andoin and Rosen had interacted with the three arbitrators before. They immediately recognized that the aura they had felt from Lin Li was extremely similar to what they had felt from the arbitrators. It was as if heaven and earth followed his will, and the world laws resolved around this single person irresistibly. Could it be he had already reached Sanctuary Realm? Thinking of that, Andoin and Rosen were stunned. Andoin still remembered that, when he had picked up Lin Li in the mountains a few years ago, Lin Li was still a magic illiterate who didn't even know how to meditate, and wasn't even considered a mage apprentice. Although Andoin could see that Lin Li was extremely talented in magic, probably more so than Garesco, he couldn't imagine that Lin Li would have reached Sanctuary Realm so fast. After all, even the god of mages, Garesco, only reached Sanctuary Realm at 30. That was coupled with his incredible talent in magic, belonging to an esteemed family of mages, and receiving high-quality magic education from a young age. On the other hand, Lin Li only used a few years to reach the peak of magic abilities from being an amateur. That speed was something Garesco couldn't compare to. Other than shock, Andoin felt more pleasantly surprised. After all, he was the one who had found Lin Li and introduced him to the world of magic. Seeing that his student had achieved so much, Andoin naturally felt a sense of accomplishment. Rosen, who was standing beside Andoin, looked extremely glum. Much as he didn't want to believe that Lin Li had reached the Sanctuary Realm, he couldn't find another explanation for the suppressive aura he had just experienced. Now he finally understood why the three arbitrators thought so highly to Lin Li. It was because Lin Li had already reached the same level as the arbitrators. If Rosen had known Lin Li had reached Sanctuary Realm, he wouldn't have suggested that proposal no matter what. He had thought that with his status in the Supreme Council, he could crush Lin Li like an ant and didn't treat him seriously at all. It turned out that Rosen was the ant. Recalling what happened during the meeting that day, Rosen felt like he was a clown, utterly disgusted by what he had done. Rosen felt like he had aged a lot at that moment. He didn't have any desire to fight for power anymore. This wasn't because he didn't want to, but rather because he knew everything would be futile. The difference in abilities between Lin Li and him couldn't be made up for by sheer trickery or plotting. Moreover, with the relationship between Lin Li and Andoin, Rosen was clear that he couldn't fight with Andoin at all, given that Andoin had a Sanctuary Realm supporter. Not to mention fighting with Andoin, Rosen could even guess why the three arbitrators chose to meet Lin Li. Once Lin Li stabilized his standing in the Supreme Council, Rosen could totally imagine how miserable his own life would be. Unlike Andoin and Rosen, Joey and those around Lin Li didn't think about Lin Li reaching the Sanctuary Realm at all, even though they were equally shaken by the aura Lin Li had released just now. After all, Honor had only just stepped into the Legendary Realm, while the others were all archmages. Thus, they didn't have a clear understanding of what Sanctuary Realm power looked like. However, Joey and the rest were still very shocked by the power Lin Li had displayed. With a gentle tap of his finger, tens of legendary level souls of the dead as well hundreds of close to legendary level souls of the dead all perished in a flash. This kind of power was unimaginable to these people. As for whether it was the peak of legendary level or Sanctuary Realm power, it wasn't too different to them. They recollected what had happened when Candyman challenged Lin Li at the hall. It was then that they finally realized why Lin Li acted so harsh. Judging from Lin Li's power just now, Lin Li could have easily defeated Candyman even if Arbitrator Apophis hadn't appeared. Fulik, Seeing that Linley had dealt with all the souls of the dead and retracted his mana and aura, Anduin hurried towards him and stared at him with a weird expression. He complained, "You lad, when have you reached this level? I didn't even know about it, and have worried about you for a long time." Linley rubbed his nose and smiled at Anduin without appearing any different from before. "Ha ha, it's all because of your good teaching, as well as a little luck on my side." When Rosen came to Anduin's side, he looked more composed, but he didn't say anything. This wasn't because he didn't want to say anything, but rather because he couldn't totally control his very complicated feelings. Even if he were to say any words of flattery, it would inevitably bring out his true emotions. As such, it was better to stay silent. Luckily, Anduin didn't talk long to Linley. They didn't talk about the sanctuary realm in too much detail, and only briefly talked about the situation of the Calamity. If not, it would be too awkward for Rosen standing at the side. After Anduin and Rosen left, Linley and Joe's team came to the teleportation portal. Everything that happened just now seemed only like an interlude to this journey, but everyone now looked at Linley with more awe and respect. Only the mana source of the teleportation portal was damaged by the souls of the dead. This wasn't a big problem to Linley at all. After replacing the mana source with a random magical crystal he had taken out, the teleportation portal was back online. With a spark, Lin Li and the team disappeared behind the teleportation portal. At that moment, the mages who had heard the alarm reached the teleportation portal. Unfortunately, no one saw the scene where Linley killed off all the souls of the dead single-handedly. Who has released the aura just now? Did the arbitrators come? A middle-aged legendary mage stood next to the corpses of those unfortunate mages. If not for these corpses, he would have thought the alarm was false. That's too powerful. It must have been Lord's arbitrators. If not, how can someone chase away those souls of the dead so quickly? Another legendary mage looked around. He didn't sense any remnant of battle at all, so those souls of the dead had to have been chased away by absolute power. Out of the entire Supreme Council, he couldn't think of anyone other than the 3 arbitrators who possessed such immense power. I saw President Flick of the Guild of Magic in the breezy plains walking in this direction just now. Could he be the one? Impossible. The aura just now definitely belonged to a sanctuary powerhouse. It's possible that the arbitrators had struck because of him. He's so lucky. With the arbitrators' protection, he may even become a high-ranking counselor someday. No matter what was being said in the Sky Garden, Lin Li and the team had arrived at the teleportation portal in Alana Guild of Magic. Macklin, who had been teleported here earlier, was already standing outside of the teleportation portal. He walked towards Lin Li immediately after seeing him appear, convincing Lin Li to stay for a few days, no matter what. Seeing that Lin Li and Macklin were very close to each other, even cracking bad jokes about each other, Joe's and Hanar's facial muscles twitched. Before this, they wouldn't have felt so strongly about this, as they thought that Lin Li was just a president of a guild of magic just like them. However, it was different now. The aura that Lin Li had released during the Calamity felt as if it was heaven's will, and was still fresh in their memory. Looking at Lin Li joking casually with Macklin, they couldn't associate the two images together. It was as if seeing an elegant and sacred goddess at one moment, and then seeing her dig her toes and spurting vulgarities the next. That strong contrast almost made them want to vomit blood. Although he was chatting with Macklin, Lin Li didn't forget about his promise to Joey. He asked Macklin for a suitable place, and took out 5 magical crystal cannons, and a few boxes full of magical crystals, from his ring of endless storm. Even Macklin's eyes shone upon seeing all these things. Although Alana Guild of Magic was quite wealthy, most of their resources were directed towards training mages. Thus, items like the magical crystal cannons were still considered luxury items for them. As for Joey and Mason, they knew Lin Li wasn't boasting when he promised them the items. However, the shock they felt when seeing these items in front of their own eyes was still immense, and they couldn't control their excitement. As a guild of magic, it would be a lie to say that they weren't angry that they were constantly harassed by a group of lowly pirates. However, they couldn't do anything about it given the limited ability of the 2 guilds. Not to mention the pirates, even the other factions in Chevan City had slowly stopped to respect the Guild of Magic because of their incapability. If used well, these 5 magical crystal cannons would be enough to exterminate these pirates completely. They could also pose a threat to other factions, securing the guild's utmost status in Chevan City. Although it wasn't too honorable to use an external item as a threat, at least the mages in the guild wouldn't be disturbed by the outside world frequently, and could research magic in peace. Seeing that Lin Li was so generous, Macklin had to do something to help too. After all, Alana Guild of Magic was also the headquarters to all guilds of magic. How could it just sit back when a guild under it was bullied? As such, Macklin remarked with assurance that the Alana Council would send mages to guard the magical crystal cannons when Joey and his team were transporting them back, and also to help the Chevan City Guild of Magic annihilate the pirates. After Joey and his team left for their respective guilds, Lin Li still remained at the Alana Guild of Magic. However, as there was still much for him to attend to, he only stayed for 3 days before bidding farewell to Aldwin. It had only been 10 odd days since Linley had left the Tower of Dusk for the Sky Tower together with Arbitrator Chris. However, the change in the Tower of Dusk was obvious. The news that Linley had reached Sanctuary Realm had been quickly dismissed as a hoax at the so-called centers of the magic civilization, but it had become widespread in the breezy plains. After the meeting held at the Tower of Dusk last time, countless large to medium-scaled factions had been subdued. Under such circumstances, no one would doubt the authenticity of this piece of news. If Linley wasn't a sanctuary powerhouse, how could he subdue all these powerful factions? Now, the Tower of Dusk's businesses in the breezy plains had reached a new high that no other faction could ever dream of exceeding. No faction dared to harass the Tower of Dusk at all. Of course, Linley wouldn't really ruin the other factions' businesses. He still chose collaboration as his main strategy. After all, the Tower of Dusk still couldn't monopolize the breezy plains businesses given its current level of development. However, the economic aspect wouldn't change much in a mere dozen days. One could only see an increase in the business agreements signed. The most obvious difference in the Tower of Dusk had to do with the Guild of Magic's members. All around the Tower of Dusk, residential areas were built for the mages to reside in. When Linley had left, less than a quarter of the residential areas were occupied. However, when Linley came back over a dozen days later, the number of mages living there had increased exponentially. Before that, the mages joining the Tower of Dusk were mostly Dulan locals, and only occasionally came from other areas. This was a common phenomenon as any faction would try to retain talents within their own territory. Thus, fighting for territory wasn't just for resources, but also talents indispensable for the development of a faction. Although the Tower of Dusk was already quite famous before this, and offered excellent treatment to its mages, many mages still chose to stay in their local factions. Why was that so?
Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.